The Persephone Foundation, Timeline Archives. Timeline designation Sigma Nu-013. Codename, you call this Archaeology? In 1935, the esteemed American archaeologist Dr. Henry Jones Jr. was gunned down by Chinese gangsters in Shanghai, China. Dr. Jones, or Indiana as he was known to his friends, was mourned throughout the American archaeological community. Little did anyone know that his death would have major consequences beyond academia. In 1935, what is the first well-documented supernatural war began. The Thuggee cult, led by the enigmatic and ruthless High Priest Mola Ram, led a revolt against the British. Using the powers of the 5 Sankara stones, the Thuggee struck down British and loyal Indian soldiers with pillars of fire. Convinced that the will of Shiva was with the Thuggee, many Indians joined the rebellion. The British mobilized for a long, bloody war to preserve the crown jewel of the British Empire. The Japanese, sensing an opportunity to liberate Asia and take it for themselves, sent covert aid to the Thuggee rebels. Meanwhile, Mohandas Gandhi and Subhas Chandra Bose worked with the British to stop the Thuggees, desiring to see an independent India that was not dominated by violent cultists. Meanwhile, in Egypt, a German expedition led by French archaeologist René Belloc rediscovered the long-lost Ark of the Covenant. Wishing to demonstrate Aryan mastery over the Jewish god, Hitler ordered the Ark opened and presented before the international community during the 1936 Berlin Olympics. After the torchlighting ceremony, Hitler announced to the world that German archaeology had solved one of history's greatest mysteries. Before a massive crowd from all nations, the Ark was presented and opened. Unfortunately for everyone present in the Olympic Stadium that day, the Ark unleashed God's wrath upon everyone present. Hitler, the top echelons of the Nazi Party, and thousands of guests from all over the world perished. In a few moments, Germany was effectively without a government. A quick fight for control saw the Wehrmacht take control, with any Nazi officials unwilling to cooperate placed under arrest or executed. The events of the Berlin Olympics definitively proved what the war in India had demonstrated for a year. The supernatural exists. Even the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was forced to repudiate the total falsehood of religion. The world's intelligence agencies scrambled over one another to find supernatural artifacts, but the few that were rediscovered were of little use militarily. Rumors that the Italians found the Holy Grail were popular, but ultimately amounted to nothing. With the fall of the Third Reich, the power structure of Europe was drastically altered. Germany, which was on the rise, was literally struck down by the wrath of God. The Wehrmacht leadership busied itself with making amends to the Jews in an effort to avoid more divine punishment, and abandoned ideas of war with neighboring European countries. Meanwhile, Mussolini saw an opening. Forming an alliance with Austria and Hungary and cozying up to the Catholic Church, Mussolini claimed that the modern world had done wrong by abandoning the wisdom of the past. This modernism was embodied by the Soviet Union, which Mussolini claimed would inevitably march west and destroy Western civilization. To counter this threat, Mussolini formed the Pact of Steel, an alliance which in practice challenged France's Little Entente as much as it did the Soviets. During the Spanish Civil War, the Pact of Steel would back Franco's nationalists, but it would be the Soviet-backed factions of the Republican side that would triumph in that conflict. Meanwhile, in Asia, the war in India slowly merged with Japan's war in China. The Japanese became more and more aggressive, accusing the British, French, and Americans of illegally supporting China and subjugating Asia's peoples. In truth, the Japanese coveted the resource-rich European colonies. In October of 1940, tensions finally broke out into open war as Japan launched several simultaneous attacks against British, French, and Dutch colonies throughout Asia. Believing that the Europeans were too busy quarreling with Italy and the Soviet Union, and that the British were too exhausted with their war in India, the Japanese expected a quick knockout victory that would force the Europeans to the negotiating table. Instead, the Japanese brought the wrath of the West upon them, joined by the United States after American ships coming from the Philippines were attacked indiscriminately by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese fought the Europeans fiercely, at one point using a dragon recovered in China. But by 1944, their Asian colonial empire was completely shattered. The Anglo-Americans invaded in early 1945 and were met with fanatical resistance, and the war only ended with the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. The war in Asia exhausted the European colonial empires, and by the 1950s it was no longer profitable to support them. The war in India ended in 1946, and the British granted the Indians independence under the Indian National Congress, as they promised, in exchange for its support against the Thuggees. To Britain's chagrin, the Indians turned towards the Soviets for support. Nationalist revolts, supported by Italy and the Soviet Union, pressured the Europeans into leaving. Even though wars between pro-fascist, pro-communist, and pro-Western factions normally broke out as soon as the last colonial troops boarded the boat. The rest of the 20th century will see conflicts between the Anglo-American French bloc, the Pact of Steel, and the Communist bloc. The proliferation of nuclear weapons makes war between any two of the blocs too dangerous to contemplate, and it is rumored that even worse weapons are being developed. Points of interest. Some psychos think that aliens with crystal skeletons built cities here. What a load of crap. The Peruvian communists here decided that killing anyone who looks smart is a great way to ensure the revolution goes just as planned. Paraguay's territorial ambitions are in line with Rome's. For now, at least. The Estado Novo regime is a safe haven for former Spanish nationalists. Very paranoid and think the Reds are out to take Angola and Mozambique. They're not entirely wrong. Nasty military dictatorship, but at least anti-Semitism is banned. No longer concerned about Germany taking the Sudetenland. Under a reactionary Catholic regime, the wrath of God stuff really made an impression. Miffed that it lost its chance to seize territories lost to Romania. Also under a reactionary Catholic regime, but trust the French to do a better job than the Italians. Islamists overthrew the military. Communists managed to mop up after most of the fighting was done. The Hété Republic is the home of the Holy Grail, according to the ramblings of the late, senile Henry Jones Sr. He clearly didn't take his son's death well. The French fought desperately for Algeria. The Italians supported them in exchange for Tunisia, but both powers ultimately lost. Less communist and more screw Rome and Paris. Lots of Jews moved in from Germany for fear of reprisals from the 1936 incident. Quite confident, what with the proof that their God exists and isn't afraid to smite the Jews' enemies. Very religious. Want the Ark back, arguing that it was, after all, found in their territory. The international community believes it belongs in a museum. A heavily guarded museum. Rhodesia isn't going to budge on the apartheid issue. Neither is South Africa. Gained independence with the help of America's best friend, Uncle Ho. Rebuilt in America's image. One of its most stalwart allies in the East. This has been a Persephone Foundation Timeline Reading. Thank you for listening.